Greetings sailors and welcome back to All Warships and actually a Patreon supporter replay. I have decided, along with the more Twitch based focus of my time that I'm doing these days, that instead of what I have been doing previously and increasingly spottingly, the supporter spotlight strand, I am now just going to do individual replays that are submitted, because I can get them out that much more often, because that's definitely a thing I've been slacking on. I've got this whole replays supporter tier on my Patreon and they've all been very patient with me, but yeah, I think people's patience must be starting to run out at this point. So now that I'm back into the swing, I hope, of making videos a bit more regularly, you'll definitely see a fair few of them, of the viewer submitted ones being these Patreon ones. So this is Pirate in the Ibuki, which is the first of the Japanese cruisers that really starts to feel like it gets any decent range to work with, principally because at tier 9 you get that final equipment slot which gives you the 16% range upgrade, and in addition to that, possibly, I think he's probably using that, I don't know, you do also have the option of increasing the rate of fire, which some people do. I can't remember what the ranges with and without are, to be honest, so this might actually be without that mod. This might be more for rate of fire is built here, but it does also have a spotter plane, so we can get a range boost as and when needed. Now this is going to be a slightly unusual game in that his team isn't actually going to get any cap circles for quite a long time, and usually that's very bad news. That means that the enemy team has the cap circles and they're steadily accumulating points, and at that point your team has lost. But this game is going to be, as I say, unusual in that it's not going to work out quite that way at all. The usual scenario where an enemy team does have cap circles and yet still loses is generally because your own team has managed to kill enough enemy ships to keep pace or even get ahead on points, basically. So that can happen, and again, it's fairly rare, but that's not really what's going to happen here, because although the enemy team is capping the mid circle, they're not capping either the north or south circles, A and C, and neither team is going to get those for quite a while. So it's more the fact that the enemy team only has that midpoint circle, and the trading in terms of ships is going to be relatively equal. So the advantage from one team having cap circles and the other team having none is going to be, well, almost, I'm not going to say non-existent, but almost irrelevant with how this works out. I mean, they managed to keep the enemy team away from those north and south cap circles for long enough that they're also inflicting damage at the same time, and well, it's gonna... I'm kind of giving away this is going to be a win, but mostly the games I show are wins, so that's probably not going to be a surprise. So yeah, it's not going to prove to be a sufficient detriment to this team's chances of winning, let's put it that way. But this is very unusual. I can't emphasize this enough. I've not really seen many examples of that, and even the more common example where an enemy team does manage to grab cap point superiority, which technically the enemy team does have, even if they only have the one, that they just die very rapidly. That's not going to be the case here at all. It's just that they're dying quickly enough for that one cap circle to not provide an overwhelming advantage, and they themselves are not dying in droves, which can quite often be the case as well. But this is just very unusual, and you know, hands up if you spotted why this is occurring as it is. Well, as you might have noticed from the initial load-in screens, as you might be noticing from the team list, there are no destroyers. And that's 100% why this weird situation has ended up being the case. And I anecdotally feel like since the carrier rework overall, there have been more games like this. Not huge numbers of games, but notably more games where there's only one or even no destroyers per team, and especially if there's a carrier in play and you're the only destroyer, it's not a fun experience. And so that kind of ends up depressing the numbers even further, potentially. So, in a way, it's matches like this, are the fault of carriers, I think, and maybe you can point some of the blame at how many radar ships there are now around at higher tiers as well, in that actually getting a game without radar tier 8 plus is pretty unusual these days. It can happen, but like I said, there are enough radar ships around that generally speaking, there's at least one per team, if not more. But yeah, I think it is carriers. I think it's carriers that are having this depressing effect on higher tier destroyer populations generally. There are still games with multiple destroyers at higher tiers. They definitely happen. And sometimes you'll even have games where it's, 4 or 5 destroyers, and those can be sort of not fun in their own way, but again, not as much as they used to be, just because there's so much radar around. And of the destroyers you do see, it tends to be the ones with better AA. Or at least it does in my experience. Again, completely anecdotal. Tony Wargaming knows for sure if destroyer numbers are down at the higher tiers since the rework, but I can say for sure they are examining the interaction still between carriers and destroyers in particular, so they're not unaware. It's just I have no idea what may happen or when may happen. That's like the one thing I know for sure, is that Wargaming are aware of it and are looking at it, and I can't really say anything beyond that without it just being pure speculation. So far, Pirate Skenya's been managing to keep his health untouched, which is no mean feat in an Ibuki, but he's been making heavy use of these islands here, and although this doesn't have the best firing arcs, they are good enough that he's been able to get now nearly 80,000 damage without really exposing himself too much. But a lot of his allies that have been down here have been picked apart by the enemy team, but it's not like the enemy team hasn't also been suffering their own losses in the meanwhile. Although right now they are down more ships. I mean, we're about to lose this Pommern, but they're about to lose that Yamato, so points-wise, this is starting to not look good, and they are now getting the C cap. So if I didn't know the outcome of this match, I would be watching this at this point. Indeed, did watch it at this point the first time round, and thought to myself, this looks like it's starting to slide away from them a bit. But then those 2 kills happen in rapid succession, and this Alsace is now extending forwards, more or less unsupported. There is only a Venezia here as well, which is still fairly potent, but it doesn't particularly have a fast rate of fire, and so the Alsace has made themselves a target ripe for picking on. Although I have to say, Pirate Skenya is also getting a little bit lucky with these shots he's taking from the Alsace, because I know firsthand quite how squashy the Ibuki can be. It's not necessarily a particularly good shot at a good ship for fighting in open water at closer ranges. The last of the Japanese cruisers before the Zhao, really, that has any appreciable amount of armor for its tier is the Miyoko. I said Miyogi there. No, that's the tier 4 battleship. Megami, there we go. The Megami and the Ibuki both are really quite squashy in comparison. And the Ibuki in particular can feel like it's getting punished pretty hard. So you can at least stick the extra range on it, as I said at the start. But even then, you can still take very nasty long-range battleship hits from all over the place that you don't really want to. Anyway, so the Georgia's now charging in there against the Alsace, and their secondaries will be pinging away, hopefully doing a bit of extra damage. And presumably they themselves have done some damage against the Alsace, but I suspect, just looking at the amount that his own damage has topped up to, I suspect the majority of those hit points have gone to Piritskhenia, as indeed does the kill. Unfortunately, the Georgia themselves, in the meantime, has exposed their broadside to that Venezia, and those SAP shells do hurt, but they're now angling back in again a bit. And it also means that as they've been occupying the Venezia's attention, Piritskhenia himself hasn't, which is probably a good thing overall for his health, although he has just taken a little bit of damage from the enemy carrier. So the Georgia goes down, unfortunately. That just leaves him with the rather healthy looking Venezia and an Albemarle hoving into view. However, those torpedoes are about to find their mark, and as they are the highly damaging torpedoes that the Japanese cruisers tend to get, they really just about killed the guy, and his guns were then able to make very short work of him after that. So that just leaves the Albemarle, and he's also got Stalingrad here with him as well, although they're not particularly high health at the moment. There goes the Hydro, because he knows Albemarle has got torps too, and rather better angles. And actually, there's the Venezia's torps. That's just how slow those Italian cruiser torpedoes actually travel. Meanwhile, the enemy team did cap C after a while, but we're now starting to finally flip it, and it's not there yet. But, you know, we're up to how many minutes elapsed now? Coming up to 14 minutes elapsed, and this is the first that Piritskhenia's team is now actually actively getting a cap. They were a bit down on points at one point, as I pointed out, but look how far apart they are. It's not that big of a gap at all, and they've just managed to keep plugging away, stay the course, and actually outpace the enemy team in terms of kills. So, with 5+ minutes still left on the clock, this is actually now coming back round in their favour, especially as this Albemarle is about to go down as well. Although, if these torps land, and there's I think a moment of indecision there as to what to try and get past them or whether to turn in, and it almost costs him a hit, although it only would have been the one, but still, that would not have been particularly welcome. Yeah, he could have come a cropper there if he'd made the wrong decision and tried to go onwards, but, you know, he chose correctly, but only kind of just in the nick of time to avoid taking any damage completely. So there goes that guy. That just leaves the rune, and from this stage onwards they've basically won. There's nothing the enemy team can now do to bring this back around. There isn't sufficient time that this might be winnable on points, and they certainly don't have the lead to win this on points, so it's just a matter of who gets this final kill. You can actually see that how low that Stalingrad went. So there was a bit of long-range gunnery here. I cut most of it out because Piritskhenia doesn't really get much extra damage out of this rune. And I did wonder if it would maybe be the Republic that got the kill for a Kraken, but it was actually the Siegfried in the end. So Kraken denied for the Republic, who otherwise was obviously doing more than their fair share with 4 kills and a pretty reasonable place on the score screen as well. But as you can see, Piritskhenia, first place next to that Republic, not that far off, 200,000 damage, 2 kills of his own, 2,500 base XP. Yeah, he did do quite a bit in that one, but it's one of those games that had quite a lot of slow build-up to it. And the fact that he played so cautiously in the beginning and used those islands rather than rushing in, trying to get a cap, which almost certainly would have got him spotted, yeah, it really paid off in the end. Sometimes you really do have to be a lot more cautious than your instincts are maybe telling you, especially if you're in that kind of situation where the enemy team has a cap circle advantage, even if it isn't a particularly major one. So like I said, quite an unusual way for a game to work out, but it did allow Piritskhenia to show off the power of those Japanese heavy cruiser high explosive shells, which are quite potent, and especially so once you get up to the Zao, which has rather more armour to work with as well. And so overall, you know, I think it was quite nice to be able to show a good outing in the Ibuki, which is sometimes quite tricky to pull off otherwise, just because of how comparatively squashy it is. So hopefully you have enjoyed this replay, and if you have, you can do all the usual things down underneath the video, and of course, as always, stay tuned for more.